Hello, it's Ramsey Dewey over here in Shanghai, China. Welcome to another edition of Q&A with the Coach. Today we have a question from our friend Chris Whitmer, who is a fantasy writer. And he has some questions about how to write a martial arts character in the context of a magical high fantasy world. He says, the context I'm working on is a fantasy world with magic, with mages, with anything else you might imagine. There are magic people, non-mage people with conflicts of all kinds. I'm trying for a high level of authenticity, realism within a high fantasy setting, considering the logical implications of everything else in the world. With that said, I'm wondering, how would a magic user fight in hand-to-hand situations? Or what would martial arts for a mage be like? Okay, let's stop right there. There's more to this question, but we'll get to that in a bit. We have to understand what are the limitations of your characters. Because magic can be anything. Magic can potentially do anything. Your imagination is the limit to what it can do. So you have to give some structure and some limitations to your characters in order to answer that question. Are we talking about wizards that can snap their fingers and just do whatever the heck they want? Or are we talking about a guy who really has to work for it, where he's got to chant some magic words and it takes him some time to get that spell charged up or whatever before he can do it, and there's a guy running at him with a sword, and so time is this huge limiting factor? I don't know, but you have to come up with some limitations. You have to come up with some rules for how magic works in this particular story. And magic works differently. They've got different rules in every fictional universe that uses it. Let's talk about Elder Scrolls for a minute, because I love the Elder Scrolls series, especially Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind, because I'm one of those old school nerds who love that game. I also loved it because it really fit into the high fantasy genre, which I enjoy a lot, the sword and sorcery type of genre. And that game had structure and rules which the following games did not, particularly if you contrast it with Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. I don't know if you play video games, but I'll explain a little bit. Skyrim is a power fantasy. It's a power fantasy, meaning you can do everything. You can have a Mary Sue character that can progress in every direction without limitation. Whereas in Morrowind, in the previous games, you had to role play, because it was an actual role-playing game. Now, you could create a wizard and put on heavy armor and then struggle really hard and work really hard and eventually learn how to use that. Or you could create a barbarian and eventually develop skills with magic, but it would be a whole lot easier if you just made a barbarian and taught him how to use an axe, because that's where his talents were. Or make a wizard right off the bat and teach him to use magic, because that's his natural proclivity, right? But you did have the potential to branch off into other areas of expertise in Morrowind. But again, in Skyrim, there were more blurry rules. There were fewer limitations. And so for the first playthrough, it's fun. It's kind of like playing a game with cheat codes that allow you to do everything. But after a while, that's not fun anymore, because there are no limitations. So if we are role-playing, and I think role-playing games have a lot, like the good role-playing games, where you really play a role, have a lot to do with telling a good story. And that's one of the reasons Morrowind is so popular to this day among the fans, is not because of the graphics, because they're very dated, not because of the controls or anything like that, because again, it's very dated by today's standards. A lot of younger gamers play it for the first time and they're like, this game is unplayable. But why do people remember that game so fondly? Well, it's because of the story. Not just the writing on the screen, but the player's immersive interaction with the story. And so much of that comes because of the limitations. So you got to give yourself some limitations to answer your question. Let's read on Chris's question. He says, essentially, how would you get yourself a moment of space when dealing with an aggressive fighter. Okay, so I'm assuming you need some space, you need some time to use this magic, right? So how do you do that? Well, you can run away. You can push kick him away. You can throw some sand in his face. You can create a distraction. What's that over there? Abracadabra. Boom. There are lots of ways to go about that, but again, that depends entirely on the limitations and the rules you create for how magic works in this universe. The next idea, says Chris, the next idea was that a mage would use magic to augment their physical abilities and overwhelm an opponent. Okay, now, I've seen a few different stories, a few different works of fiction, movies, more so video games. They use this trope. It's a fairly common trope in video games to use magic to make you stronger or faster or have more fighting capability. But ultimately, what those types of spells do, they make you stronger, but they don't make you a better player at the game. You can cast a spell to increase your strength, to allow your sword to do more damage or whatever it is, but ultimately it's up to the player. If they suck at playing the game, they're still going to suck at playing the game. They're just going to hit heavier, right? Whereas if you compare that with a magic user like, say, Shang Tsung, the antagonist of the Mortal Kombat series, this evil sorcerer who sucks the souls out of fighters, and by doing so amasses their fighting ability and adds it to his own, and just assimilates their fighting prowess, and then he can fight like they did without training. That's a weird power, man. But an interesting one as far as magic goes. And thereby being able to overwhelm his opponents. But Chris goes on to say, maybe the best question to ask would be, how would you coach a mage to make use of their abilities alongside martial arts? Well, at risk of saying something completely different, which I will because I don't want to repeat again and again and again, just give your character some limitations, because I've said that so many times so far. Look to some common tropes as far as magic users go in works of fiction. Let's go back to video games again. Let's go back to some old school video games. Remember, like, Dragon Warrior, the early Final Fantasy 1. Remember that one for the Nintendo? You had, how many character classes? There was the fighter. He could equip most of the swords and the axes and most of the heavy armors and use most of the weapons and the armors and shields and so on, but had no magic, right? And then you had the thief, who was a pretty useless character because he didn't have any special abilities. He had no magic. He couldn't equip a lot of weapons and armor. There was the monk, who had no magic again, but he started out as a pretty weak character, but eventually would become super powerful in hand-to-hand combat. There was the black mage, or the black wizard, who had the destructive magic. There was the white mage, the white wizard, who had the healing, defensive magic. There was the red mage, the red wizard, who had a small amount of defensive, a small amount of offensive magic, and then a moderate amount of fighting ability. The rogue type character, basically. And you could mix and match a party of 4 of these, and so on. Now, if you look at the fighting capability of the magic specialists, the white mage, the black mage, the offensive wizard, the defensive wizard, if you will, their fighting abilities sucked. They were always super weak. Super weak. They had very low hit points. They didn't do a lot of damage. They got killed easily if targeted by the physical characters, right? And so you had to protect these guys. You had to kind of put them in the back, if you will. You had to use the big physical characters, the tanks, to protect these specialists. So as I was reading this, I was thinking a mage would do a whole lot better in combat if they were with a group of fighters. You know, kind of like a video game. What does that do for a story? It also gives you the chance to write some compelling and dynamic relationships between different characters. What's the most popular book out there about magic using people? Probably Harry Potter. And Harry Potter's the main character. His name is on the book, right? But throughout most of the book, Harry Potter has this little entourage of friends surrounding him. And they all bring something different to the table. And by doing so, it's quite interesting because Harry Potter never becomes this overpowered Mary Sue who can solve all his problems by himself. It's this group effort. And we can relate to that. And different people, you know, for example, my daughters, when they watched Harry Potter, they really loved that movie. They were like, whoa, we love Hermione. We can identify with her because she's the girl, right? Because little girls are pretty simple like that. And other people, other little boys might say, well, I like Harry Potter, or I like Ron, or I like whoever. The little goblin creature, he's my favorite. Because each one brings something different to the reader or to the viewer to experience. And we can identify with different characters in different ways. But it's very, very difficult to identify with a person who can do everything and solve all their problems by themselves instantly, or with very little effort or help from anyone else. Why? Because we're communal creatures. Humans are community-driven. The whole reason our species exists is because we have a community around us. If you put humans in the wild without a community and try to raise a family, oh man, we would have been extinct a long time ago. Why? You ever heard a baby cry? Wah, wah, wah. And this goes on and on and on and on for years and years. And if you did not have a community built around that child to protect it from predators, those children would never live past their first birthday. They would be instantly eaten by wild animals. So it's very important as a survival mechanism that we have people around us, but it's also very important as a literary mechanism, for the simple reason that your readers, your audience, will be able to relate to it. So look at that old school RPG mentality of having the party of the magic user who specializes in magic. He has limitations. He's a weakling. He's a nerd. He can't fight. Maybe he can swing a little stick around, but he doesn't really know what he's doing. But he needs that big jock to protect him, to stand in the way. And maybe they don't like each other. Maybe they're not friends. Maybe they need to come to some sort of understanding. Maybe they have a mutual problem. And then they have that synthesis where they realize, hey, we're better off together. Let's team up. And yeah, man, those limitations that you give your characters are going to make them interesting. It's not just going to answer the question of how are they going to fight, but how are they going to be interesting to your audience? Maybe they can't fight. Maybe your wizard sucks at fighting. Maybe that's why he became a wizard in the first place, because he wanted that magic answer. I mean, that's what I wanted out of martial arts when I started, because I was a wimpy little nerd who wanted magic to solve my problem. There were no martial arts schools. I was being beaten up by bullies at school. I wanted to fight back like Bruce Lee. There was no dojo to train at. So what did I do? I went to the library and checked out all the books I could find on martial arts. I found this book on karate. And what did that book tell me? On page 1, it said karate is not magic. Martial arts is not magic. Oh, no, but I wanted it to be magic. It went on to say, if you want to be good at fighting, it takes hard work, exercise, strength training, dedication, and all these other attributes that I sorely lacked. Oh. I was so disappointed. I wanted a magic spell, Hadouken, that I could throw at my opponent and make him stop and to solve my problem. But I didn't have that. I had to work really, really hard. I had to dedicate my life to it to get any good at fighting. So in a world where magic is real, in this fantasy world where magic is real, where a nerd who gets picked on and beaten up and wants to solve his problems with violence, or with magic to replace the violence, if you will, he's probably not going to have the time to go out there to learn hand-to-hand combat to a proficient degree, if we're in the realm of magical realism anyway. Instead, he's probably going to be dedicated to the craft of spellcasting, right? And I imagine that's probably something that should be difficult. It should be something that is earned, because that's an OP ability, man. Magic should be an overpowered ability, but with, of course, limitations to make it interesting. Think about Lord of the Rings for a minute. Man, Lord of the Rings, who's the big, awesome wizard that we all love from Lord of the Rings? Gandalf, right? Quick, off the top of your head, name a magic spell that Gandalf used. And some of you might be scratching your heads unless you're a hardcore Tolkien fan. And then you could say, well, in chapter whatever, he did this spell. But Gandalf wasn't solving all the problems with magic all the time. In fact, most of the time he wasn't. He was scratching his beard, mumbling wise sayings once in a while, and prodding the Fellowship of the Ring along, or telling Bilbo a thing or two. But he wasn't usually there solving the problems with a deus ex machina, with magic. Once in a while he would make light come out of his staff or something like that. But he wasn't a MacGuffin. He was a super interesting character, the most powerful wizard, if you will. But he didn't use that power in an irresponsible way. And by irresponsible, I mean literal... What is the word? In a literarily, writingly... What is the right word? I'm not currently equipped with the word that I need to express this thought. But in the context of writing, Gandalf didn't solve problems in an irresponsible way. He did it through actions that the readers could relate to, or sometimes we would be mystified, like, where is Gandalf going? Why is he suddenly leaving the party? Why is he leaving the group behind? What lesson must they learn without the help of this powerful wizard? Let your characters struggle. Let them struggle. Let your nerdy wizard who has that magic spell, and it takes him time to cast it, and then the melee fighters coming at him, let him get lambasted because he's taken too long and he doesn't know how to move and he doesn't know how to fight and he's not athletic, right? Let him get overpowered. Let him learn from that moment, and then maybe he thinks, man, I need to know more than magic, and so maybe he goes to his fighting friends to learn some martial arts, to learn how to do a push kick or learn how to sprint or something like that. I hope that helps, Chris. Asking questions is a good place to start in the writing. Experiencing limitations leads us to ask the right questions. And when we ask the right questions, we get the right answers. Thanks for watching. Now get out there and train and write.